Today, Voices from Oxford is talking to a very interesting visitor to Oxford from Geneva, because Professor Keith Krause is Professor of International Relations there and has come to Oxford to give a series of lectures on war and violence. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. And to some extent, this little interview will form an introduction to the recording of his lectures on Voices from Oxford. So, Keith, welcome, first of all, to Oxford and to Balliol College. Your lectures have been fascinating, and I was particularly struck, as a biologist, which I am, a biological scientist, by your story at the very beginning, where you point to the fact that one person committing a violent act, which is to burn himself in a street in one city, leads to the fall of the government in that country, leads to, we need to explore that with you, but let me carry on, and then to this sort of domino effect by which you end up with the situation in Syria. Now, how do you see this? You see, to people like me, we think in terms of what's sometimes called the butterfly effect in chaos, which is the idea that even the waving of a butterfly 1,000 miles away might be a factor in causing a storm in a particular area of the world. Actually, I don't think the butterfly did that. I think it was just one tiny element in a situation that was gently poised. But you see this as very much more, if I've understood you, as very much more integrated into what actually happened. Is that correct?
Yes, and I use that story, and it's the story of the Tunisian uprising that leads to the Arab Spring, that then leads to what we now look at as the war in Syria and Iraq. And I use that story to illustrate 2 points. And the first is that in international politics, we usually begin the analysis once large-scale armed conflict has occurred. So people are now looking at ISIS, Syria, and essentially a war, without thinking about what were the antecedent conditions that might have put in place this the wave of protest that led to various kinds of uprisings. So that's my first point, is to say that these things are not disconnected, and you cannot start the story only when large-scale violence has taken place. I probably wouldn't want to think of it as the butterfly effect, but I do think that a concept that criminologists use is quite useful here, which is the notion of contagion of violence, and the way it may spread almost in an epidemiological sense. That violence begets violence within certain pathways and networks. So it doesn't spread randomly, it's not spontaneous. But the second point is also to make people think hard about what the circumstances were that led this young man to self-immolate. And here I want us to realize that Tunisia, before the uprising, was a violent place too. Even if there were not very many people being killed, there was still repression and jailing, and he was being harassed on a regular basis by the local police and officers. So there's a system of violence here that leads to certain large-scale conflicts.
So there's a social context in which could you say that certain people are pushed to the point at which violence seems to them to be the only option? Is that a fair way to sum it up?
I think it's fair. I mean, I think that one has to try and get inside the head of these people. And of course, in his case, it's a self-violent act. He commits suicide as a form of social protest. But and we did not speak to him about what he thought, but from interviews that are done with people who commit violent acts, including what we would call terrorist violence, many of them portray themselves as victims of prior kinds of violence and oppression, and that's the justification for what they do. And so understanding the system that they are part of, whether it's justified or not, they see themselves as victims, is really important part, I think, of telling the story of even large-scale violence.
Do you think that's true then also of the violence of, say, Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, that their justification would be, you did this to us, we do this to you? Is that a fair way also of putting the sense in which a context, at least is perceived to be, whether right or wrong, to be what is the justification for their actions?
Yeah, I think we need to start adding layers at that point. And so the individuals who participate in and perhaps lend legitimacy to violent actions may buy into essentially this victim narrative, if you will. But there are also actors who use these situations in a very instrumental way to mobilize and to seek power.
Indeed,
so,
yes.
So
yes.
once the snowball gets rolling, or once the contagion takes place, then this presents opportunities. And certainly in the case of ISIS and Syria and Iraq, it's clear that there were a number of people who saw this as a very good opportunity to embark in some large-scale recruitment and wreak havoc, and maybe even realize some economic or political aims.
And to seek power for themselves, essentially.
Absolutely.
Yes, that's right. Now, that leads to an obvious question, which I hope we can just spend the rest of this short interview discussing with you. This is to sort of suggest that there is a cycle here of interaction within the system, the social context of what is happening, that is very difficult to break into. And how, if ever, can one arrive at a solution to stop it?
Yes.
I mean, that's a very big question, I know, and maybe it's unfair to ask you as a professor of international relations studying it to provide a solution which politicians have to think about. But anyway, the question is there, isn't it?
Well, I have a two-part answer, and I think I'm not going to completely take the academic cop-out and say I cannot provide any insight. But in my second lecture, what I talk about is something I call the insecurity trap. Which is a good way of describing, labeling what you've just described. A situation, a system, or a context of violent interactions in which you cannot seem to break out of it, and you cannot seem to establish some kind of stable conditions for peace and order. And here, my target is those people who, in the long-term historical context, Steven Pinker and others, essentially argue that we've never lived in better times. It's never been safer, it's never been more peaceful, and that this problem is solving itself through sort of slow norm change, etc. I think that there may be some truth to that in the sort of long river of history, but there are large backwaters and eddies and turbulent spaces where people are caught in really violent insecurity traps. Now, how do we break out of those? And that I think is the real challenge. I tend to focus on essentially on institutions as the long-term solution. I do not think this is a matter of purely individual psychology, individual behavior, and socialization. So it's not about violent extremism by particular people. But it's very much connected with the inability to construct institutions that provide security, that provide stability, provide security as a public good, as opposed to something that only a few people have. And this is, I think, one thing that the international community grapples with, but does a uniformly bad job of dealing with.
Yes. Well, this is a very good way, I think, to introduce people to your fascinating lectures, and we can encourage people with this to have a look at the recordings on Voices from Oxford. So thank you very much, Keith, for talking to us.
Thank you.